Former CNN anchor Brian Stelter hosted a panel at the World Economic Forum on media disinformation and claimed that the U.S. has a lot to learn from potentially European internet regulators. As part of the panel, European Commission Vice President Věra Jourová weighed in on the topic of hate speech. Let's hear what she had to say.
As illegal hate speech, which you will have soon also in the US. I think that we have a strong reason why we have this in the criminal law. We need the platforms to simply work with the language and to identify such cases. The AI would be too dangerous.
Also on the panel, the New York Times' AG Sulzberger discussed the state of today's, quote, information ecosystem.
The term fake news and then disinformation, it was popularized 6 years ago at this point. Where are we today versus then?
What do you mean, where are we today versus then?
So this was a hot, popular topic.
Yeah.
There was an awakening about it. The social networks felt pressure. But now where are we? And same question for Jeannie, but where are we today? Versus
I see. Yeah, it's a great, and to be clear, actually, terms like fake news and enemies of the people have been popularized cyclically in society and in some of the most, repressive and dangerous moments, Nazi Germany, Stalinist Russia, right? So I think anytime we're hearing language like that applied to, a free press, or more broadly free expression, I think we should be really worried. Look, I think that there's no doubt that society seems to have, at some level, accepted how much the information ecosystem has been poisoned, and I think it's going to require real, sustained effort from the platforms, from political leaders, from business leaders, and from consumers themselves to reject that.
So I watched this entire panel. It was about 45 minutes last night, and I wrote about it for Reason. It was very interesting. So there were some of the panel members pushing back a little bit. They were grappling with the question of, well, on one hand, there's free speech. On the other hand, we're very worried about disinformation. What is the trade-off? So the panel members were, Brian Stelter was kind of the host, and then there was that woman who is a member of the European Commission, which is the governing body of the European Union, and she was talking about what Europe has done. And while it sounded in that clip like she was saying, yeah, hate speech, just got to get rid of it, she did later say that, well, look, 90% of what you call misinformation or disinformation is totally legal. So, how much authority do we actually want to give government to police that? So it wasn't totally like she was just missing that there was no downside to censorship. And then the Democratic politician was Seth Moulton, who's a Democratic representative, and he basically said the same thing. He's like, look, he was very worried about COVID speech, like anti-vaccine speech. He's like, people are dying because of it, but I know that we have the First Amendment. The most annoying thing he did was totally butcher the fire in a crowded theater analogy, saying, there are limits on free speech. You can't say fire in a crowded theater. Everyone always says that, but it's not true. You can say fire in a crowded theater if there's a fire, and that comes from like a decision where the Supreme Court said you couldn't distribute anti-war pamphlets because that would be like shouting fire in a crowded theater, which obviously is not something the Supreme Court stands by anymore because you totally could do that. So I just hate when people bring that up, but I digress. But anyway, the person on the panel who was the most in favor of greater something to police disinformation online was Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times. And I think that's kind of telling. That even like the government regulators were realizing that like this is a hard question because we don't want to criminalize free speech. But the elite media guy was like, oh no, this is the end of the world unless it's all Facebook's fault. It's another permutation of the Facebook destroyed society kind of panic.
I mean, it does strike me, just from that clip, there just seems to be no reckoning whatsoever with the reasons why people feel like there's so...
Not one word of that, no.
So little trust in the media. I know it's like your entire job is to be a trustworthy media source, ostensibly, and you have not interrogated why it is that so many people feel like you're not?
So they said they think that incorrect information is sexier, more interesting than correct information and will always beat it. And so you need much stronger limits on people's ability to access incorrect information. I mean, so this is the irony about meetings about disinformation or disinformation experts is they actually end up spreading tons of inaccurate information when they talk about it. Like some person in the audience asked a question, I'm so worried about young people consuming misinformation online, and what are we doing to educate young people so that they only can see trusted sources? No one corrected this question, but it was, young people are fine. Disinformation is consumed almost exclusively by elderly people.
Yeah.
Young people don't need training to identify misinformation. I mean, like, 1 in a million does.
Look, yes and no. I do think that we could all use a dose of media literacy education, and that's something that I think people used to get more in school and in their civics courses and things like that.
They're
And
not even getting basic algebra and reading skills are way behind.
Sure, but it is true. I mean, as I move through the world, I know that I have to check this against that. I know about that I have to look at the sources of studies and look at conflicts of interest. Like, those are things that I think not everyone does. People don't have time to do, and that's not a judgment. But there are. I think all of us could grow and become more able to discern the truth behind stories. That's something that none of us should ever just give up to the integrity of an institution, just to say, oh, I like this place, I like these people, so they must be telling the truth.
Right,
because even good people who are well-meaning can make mistakes.
But our studies and our surveys show us that overwhelmingly, the group of people that struggles to do that
is the elderly, for sure. That's why Facebook became such a cesspool.
But they're totally buying into, the people on this panel. It's all downstream of the Russian misinformation, and that's why we got Trump in 2016, and everything connects to that. They said this is the problem. In fact, everything at Davos is really just kind of beating around the bush of trying to address this central problem of disinformation being too rampant on social media, which is such a limiting worldview, I think.
Yeah. Well, look, the conversation about whether or not Europe should or shouldn't be a model is an interesting one. Not because I think that Europe ever will be a model, because we do have the First Amendment. Americans are constitutionally, both in terms of how we feel and constitutionally, literally in terms of the Constitution, just never going to let that one go. And I'm inclined to think that's probably for the best. But it is interesting that we have such an association with the First Amendment and freedom when there are peer nations that we consider to be quite free that have a very different take on how speech is handled.
Yeah.
And it always, I remember when I was taking certain comparative law classes and realizing how different, frankly,
America's free speech climate is truly very unique.
It is. I think the thought experiment of, does the world crumble down into authoritarianism if we don't have the First Amendment is an interesting one, because that hasn't been the case in Europe in large part. And I would be interested in seeing people kind of moot out that conversation a little bit more, even if it doesn't really actually mean anything for what our laws can be. I think Glenn Greenwald has gotten into a little bit of hot water for having this conversation, because Brazil's laws are much more restrictive with respect to speech. They are able to, censor a much more expansive variety of speech than we are here. And he obviously comes with American sensibility and different preferences. And there have been some tensions about in the country and with the reporting where people have characterized some of his perspective about the Brazilian laws as being anti-individuals involved, anti-Lula, let's say, as opposed to saying, well, I'm an American, I just happen to think that we should be free speech here than that they have in Brazil. It's not that Lula is especially authoritarian or anything, but I just feel differently about how they do it there. And I think if we had more comparative law conversations about how other countries do things, I think those kind of misunderstandings about what Glenn's criticism actually wouldn't be so rampant.
But there are, I've heard even, I think, progressives point out that there are downsides to some of the limiting free speech stuff, even in our sort of European counterpart countries, in Australia, where it's much harder to hold powerful people to account because it's so easy to sue someone for the libel and defamation. Much harder here in the U.S., actually, because there's a high bar to being able to criticize public officials that they don't have in Australia, for example.
Interesting.
What I was really struck by at the end, they turned again to Sulzberger, which, I'm not, I like a lot of what appears in the New York Times. I dislike a lot of it. I don't mean to bully or pick on him or the New York Times, but I think it was pretty telling how much his mindset was about, there's nothing we can do until social media, and he particularly means Facebook, is destroyed, because there's no way the light cannot beat out the dark as long as that company is just doing whatever it can.
He's just mad they stole his advertising dollars.
But when you're listening to him, there's no acknowledgement of the fact. What you're saying is you want. He said he wants Facebook to prioritize trusted sources and deprioritize other stuff. So what he's in a sense saying is the fate of the world rests on Facebook giving the New York Times free advertisement. That's what he's saying.
And that's a pervasive worldview. That's, I think,
right. At Davos, it's very pervasive.
And it's dictated a lot of what these algorithmic changes have been over the years that have hurt small, independent media sources and everybody who isn't MSNBC, Fox News, New York Times, et cetera. If you are a creator, if you're a content creator, if you're an independent journalist, and you put something on YouTube, you are just not getting. 10 years ago, you could get 500 million subscribers. You could grow quickly if your content was good. These days, you can be disappeared from the app because there is such a strong preference for authorized media.
And this preference is being pushed on these social media companies by elite media, by certain political figures, by the FBI and the CDC, and like it's not being freely chosen in a lot of cases by these companies. And I think that's a really bad. We agree that that's a really bad thing. That's something everyone outside of the elite consensus should be very worried about. And but it's the popular opinion for how to proceed at Davos. So All right, we'll continue to follow everything going on there because we think it's important and you deserve to know about it. And we'll have more Rising right after this.